In this video, we're going to take a look at the wing intersection with the fuselage of this remote controlled jet. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to carry on with the fuselage just a little bit more. I know I said we're not modeling the entire thing, but I did have a question or request asking about the intersection of the wings with the body and specifically the fillet or the blend that happens. So one image that I didn't include, which you can find on the supplier's website, was the bottom image, which shows the wings coming into the fuselage a little bit further on the bottom. And you can see that we've got this slight sort of arc there. And then they blend into the body. And this is going to be something that's, again, another interesting thing that we can sort of attack or approach. So if we take a look at this picture here, I'm going to go ahead and look at it from my front view. You can see that the wings blend in, and ultimately what happens is this flat surface here is where the wing is going to meet with the extension or the body. So the wing is removable, and then the rest of it sort of attaches here when you put it together. Now, obviously these things come apart in quite a few different ways, but this is the area that we're going to look at. So one thing that we have to look at is, one, how it blends in with the body. It is going to be smooth in some areas and a little bit sharper in others. So it's obviously smooth as it comes up above into the fuselage here, and it's a little bit sharper here. And again, we've got that bottom image or that bottom picture that shows you that it's a little bit sharper on the back and the front. And there's a little bit of a, not really a crease, but a blend that happens in a tighter transition at the bottom. But on the top side, it's actually relatively smooth. So this is where the sort of the challenge comes from. So the way that I would approach this first is I'm going to start by creating an offset plane. And I'm going to do this from my XZ plane or my mid plane. And I want to put this offset plane where the wings are going to hit the rest of the body. Now you can see that we have deviated from the body just a little bit. And again, we're only doing this as sort of a test or a sample. So I'm not too concerned with maintaining accuracy with the actual chassis or the fuselage. So now that I've got this, I'm going to start a new sketch on this plane. And then I need to determine where those wings are going to be. And again, we've got other images that sort of show where this happens. The wing, at least the section that we're interested in, sort of comes into play right where this opening is. And it goes back pretty far. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make a sketch that represents the shape of the wing. Now this entire upper piece is removable. We've got that canopy piece, and the wing is going to entirely be below that, below this line here. And what I'm going to do to start with is I'm going to create a rectangle, and the rectangle is going to sort of represent the extents or the bounds of this wing. So I need to figure out how far back it's going to go. And again, this is really just for the purposes of figuring out how to model this. But this is going to give us sort of that tangency or that, that shape that's going to help us drive it. I'm going to pull this back a little bit and maybe up a little bit, because remember what we're doing is we're creating the intersection where it's going to attach. When we look at this image over here, you can see that the wing itself is, again, it's going to blend into the body further than what we're modeling right now. And if we look at this from the top, we can also begin to play around by pulling this back. It's going to be kind of hard to do from the top because you need to grab this front edge, but we can sort of figure out where that is. And it's obviously going to blend further forward as we go. So let's go back to this side view. And now that we have this box created, I'm going to turn it into construction using X on the keyboard. You can also use the construction option in the sketch palette. I also want to use the lock or fix unfix, and I'm going to fix these corners just so that this box stays in place, because I'm going to use it to define the shape of the wing. Next, what I want to do is I want to think about if I'm going to define the shape of the wing different on the top and bottom, or if I'm just going to make sort of a smooth transition. Now, because I'm not going to spend the time to actually go through and make a true to form wing shape, that's going to take a lot of time. You're really going to have to look at the, sort of the leading and the trailing edge. I'm going to look at just using conic curves. So with my conic curve, I'm going to start from the midpoint and go to here. And when we define a conic curve, what we're actually doing is we're creating a curve that is defined by the slicing angle through a cone. And you can see that it's a start point, an end point, and then the conic is right here in the middle. So if we are going to define this in the context of this box here, what we're going to need is our start point, an end point at the mid, and then you can see that we can kind of drive this conic out. But this is going to be actually pretty difficult for us to get the entire shape. Another option that we have is to use a simple ellipse. And the simple ellipse really needs a midpoint in here somewhere. I'm going to just temporarily sort of do this. And you can see that this will give us something that's a little bit closer to that midpoint. And what we can do is we can either use sketch points or construction lines to just place a construction line at the midpoint for reference. And then we can say that this point here is going to be vertical with our reference. We can also make sure that this line is vertical and that this line is horizontal. And then we can attach it to the actual frame that we've created. So if we want to attach these, we can make them coincident. And then we can sort of drive the shape by moving things around. So if we want it to completely fill out this box, then what we can do is we can just snap it there. So again, that is not necessarily a realistic wing shape, but it gets us pretty close. We could spend a lot more time using things like splines and sort of driving that shape. But in reality, this is going to get us pretty close. Now you might be thinking, what are we going to do with it from here? Well, I'm still going to be using surfacing tools, and the first step for me in this process is to take this and actually extrude it all the way up to my origin midplane. So I'm going to use the option for the distance to be up to object, and that object is going to be that midplane. So I'm going to hold down the left mouse button, select the XZ plane, and you can see that it takes it all the way to there. And the reason this is important is because when we mirror it to the other side, then we're going to have a complete match for what this is right here. And you'll notice that I didn't taper it out at all. All I really did was I created the sort of that pedestal shape. I'm also going to take the patch tool and just fill that in as well. And I can stitch these two together. So again, what we're doing is we're creating that sort of that intersection piece. I am going to hide the canopy for now because I don't really need to see it. And here's the point where we need to think about where it's going to blend into the rest of this. Now, a couple different ways that we can do this. We can use this as a trim tool. And I'm actually going to go back to this mirror that we created. And what we could do is we could sort of go back and we could undo that mirror, or we could temporarily just retrim the left-hand side of this fuselage. So that way we're only working with half of it. But what we can do is we can use this piece as a trim tool, and that's a great starting point. So the trim tool is going to be that surface, and then I want to get rid of everything in the middle. And what that should do, that should open it up. And I could theoretically stitch these together if I also use the fuselage as a trim tool and I get rid of everything that's on the inside. So you can see here now they've sort of matched and gone together. Now I'm going to stitch these together for this example so we can just play around with an idea. But this isn't necessarily the only or best way to do this. But the idea that I'm going to play around with, and actually, quick side note, make sure that you save before you try to do any complex fillets because it could get pretty messy. So we're going to go to a fillet. We are going to select this edge and we're just going to take a look at it. So with the fillet, you'll notice that it's automatically going away at the bottom and it's becoming thicker on the top. Now this might be a great option if you're just designing your own, but remember if we look at our canvases, and specifically let's take a look at this image here, it actually blends pretty far up on the front and the back. In order to do that with a fillet, what we really need to do is create a variable fillet. So let's try the variable fillet before we ultimately get to the option that we're going to use. So the variable fillet allows us to create bigger and smaller fillets in different areas. So for example, I can put a point back here, I can create a larger fillet on the back side, larger fillet on the front side, and sort of an in-between fillet in the center. So this could give us a pretty good option for how to blend this wing in, but we really need to be careful with these variable fillet amounts. It can give you a good result, but again, we're kind of working up into an issue where this fillet here might potentially start to disappear certain edges. And then if we bring the canopy back, obviously it's not going to blend smoothly into that anymore. So while this option is valid, while we can use the variable fillets, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is the best option for what we're doing. So for our specific case, this is where it's going to get to be a little bit more advanced. What we're going to do is we're going to split the fuselage up exactly where we want this, this piece to go. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be breaking it up into multiple sections. So first I'm going to create a sketch on this face because it is planar. And then I'm going to determine where those intersections are going to be. We could do this by using another ellipse, so sort of picking the center point and then defining the area that we want to split. So we want to make sure that we come up to but not past that edge. And this right here could be the split tool that we use to split the fuselage. If you have more specific requirements, if you need to drive it more specifically on the front and the rear, then you need to take the time to create whatever sketch is required to split that up. For us, however, I'm going to do a split face. The split face is going to be my fuselage. The splitting tool is going to be this ellipse. And now what we've done is we've sort of divided that face up. Now, in reality, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of everything there so we can select it and delete it. And what we've done is we've just broken this up into two separate bodies. Now, if you want to leave some of it there, or if you want to change the way that that trim works, then what you need to do is you need to edit this sketch. So for example, if we didn't want it to be that wide at the bottom, if we actually want to connect back to this curve, we can use project, P on the keyboard, to bring that curve in. And we can also use tools like trim or break to break this curve up at specific points. Now you'll notice that it's actually going to give us some issues because this right here is construction. So let's convert that out of construction. You'll notice that it doesn't let us undo that construction. It's still keeping it as a construction line. So in some cases, we might want to add a new line or a new edge. Let's try to trim away the bottom. And then let's convert that to a construction line again. So now what we have is this upper curve, but in the lower curve, we want it to come back to here. And we can do this with splines. I'm going to go ahead and attach those. I'm going to rotate this around just so it's pointing in roughly the right direction. And then I want to use my curvature continuity or my smooth. And then I also want it to be smooth with this curve down here. And we're going to do the same thing on the back. Again, another spline from here to here. And again, I'm going to rotate this around, get it to be roughly the correct orientation, and then smooth between these two and smooth between these two. Now, remember when you're talking about tangency versus curvature continuity, tangency is controlling only the direction. It doesn't really look at the radius of curvature, or curvature continuity is looking at that radius of curvature. So now that we have this, we need to go back to our split, and we need to make sure that we have the correct curve and allow it to regenerate that and split that properly. So now this little piece is still connected down here, which means that if we delete it or get rid of it, then we still have one body. It's still connected because we left that little piece connected down there. The next thing that we need to do is we need to think about where we need to attach these two together. So in reality, this right here is actually too close for us to blend. We need to pull it further away. And the way that we need to do that is potentially to do it with a curve from the front or to use an offset surface. So I'm going to do a curve from the front. I'm going to use P on the keyboard to project this front edge so I have a reference. And I'm going to offset this in just a little bit, let's say 0.25 millimeters. And I'm going to convert that to construction. Then I'm going to use, in this case, a spline. And the spline I actually want to connect back down here to the chassis. So I'm just going to leave this point hanging out in space for right now. I'm going to rotate this around. And I want to bring it back in where this attaches. So I'm going to select that curve and I'm going to hit P on my keyboard. And this is going to project this curve in. Now notice that from the front, this right here is not actually in the same spot. That's because the chassis or the fuselage changes or it kind of tapers as we go further back on the wing, which means that we can't easily just snap this to this point because it's just not going to work that way. What we can do, however, is we can make sure that we leave this position where it intersects, and we can just worry about trimming this and only removing a portion of it. Now, it's not going to be a perfect solution. Now, the perfect solution or the ideal solution would probably be to trim away everything here and rebuild that portion underneath. But you're going to have to sort of decide what the end goal is for your design. Now, in this case, in this design, again, we've only got so many reference pictures, so we just kind of have to decide what that looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a curve, and I'm going to use that curve to trim away this surface right here. Now, because the surface is connected, we're going to have to use split body. And what I'm going to do is bodies to split will be the entire thing and this. And we need to make sure that it doesn't intersect anything else. It looks okay. And if we look in here, we now have two bodies. Now, those two bodies are still connected, but I'm going to get rid of that. So what this leaves us with is this piece here and this piece here. Now, unfortunately, we're not quite done yet. This is, again, if the fillet option doesn't work, the variable fillet at the very beginning, then what we end up needing to do is to start splitting this up in a bunch of smaller pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create yet one more sketch, and I am going to create some lines. So actually, before I do that, let's go ahead and project this one more time. I'm going to make it construction, but what this does is it gives me a center point. So I'm going to use a vertical line, and again, make sure that we do make that vertical. What that's going to do is it's going to divide up this face right in the middle, and we're going to allow it to divide this surface as well. And what that does is it gives us a median point on this upper edge as well as the edge on the fuselage itself. And that way it gives us a reference. We can either create a sketch there or we can just use it as sort of a stopping point. I want to do the same thing on the front and the rear. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because that line really needs to extend all the way through the fuselage. And that means that we're splitting the body up. And while that may be okay for this, sometimes it's unfortunate that we have to go through that. So we are going to extend it out in order to split that up. Some cases you don't need to. In this case, I think it's probably necessary, unfortunately. So instead of using split body, we're going to just split face. Select that. Our splitting tool first will be this vertical line. Notice that it also grabs that front edge because we've got extend turned on. I need to go back and find that sketch, make it visible. We're going to repeat the process doing a split face. This time we want to select this back section. The tool is going to be that edge. And we also want to split this up. This could have been done at the same time as the original, but sometimes you end up doing them in separate operations just because it's easier. And that means that we just have a few more things in our timeline. Honestly, if you're doing concept work like this, then I don't really pay too close of attention to the timeline. I'm not worried if I'm trying to make a mechanical part and I'm really worried about the order of operations, the sketches, the features that happen, the components in an assembly, then I'll pay really close attention to what's going on in the timeline. For something like this, I don't really care as much in terms of the order of operations if I'm hacking up surfaces and trimming them and deleting them. I'm just going to kind of go with the flow because it doesn't really matter as much to me. If I was designing something for production, I would take a little bit more time and care for that. But in this case, it is what it is, and we're going to just work with it. So from here, now we can start to sort of build out these sections. So we're going to go to Create Loft. I'm going to go from this upper section to this upper section. And here is where we can begin to define this. So we're going to go curvature continuity between both of them. I'm going to use aligned edges instead of free edges. This will give me a better result here. And you can see that now we're getting that nicer blend between the surfaces. I'm going to say OK. I am going to repeat that. I could have carried that loft on and probably done without splitting this in the upper section, but sometimes that doesn't work. But in this case now what we want to do is we want to use a guide. And the guide is the edge of that surface we just created. I'm going to make sure that I use curvature continuity. Again, I want to make sure that I use aligned edges and not free edges. Then I want to carry curvature continuity from that front edge. And again, you can see that we're building out that shape. So everything looks okay there. I'm going to go ahead and stitch these together, putting everything together, noting that we still haven't built out the bottom. Now the bottom is going to be a little bit trickier, and it's going to be a little bit trickier because we don't have an edge to go on here because we trimmed it away. One thing that we could do is, first let's do a quick save. We could bring back the section that we removed here. So at some point we deleted a surface. If we just roll back and find it, if we keep this surface or a copy of it, then we can use that as sort of a blend point, a potential blend point. So what I'm going to do at this point in the timeline is I'm going to create an offset of that, 0 millimeters, and I'm going to roll back all the way forward. So what this means is now I've got a copy of that surface right here. I can mirror it to the other side if I need to, and I also have it as that reference if I need it. So we could also create a sketch and an edge here, which is perfectly valid, and we can use that as part of our boundary. So let's go ahead and create a sketch, and let's try that option, noting that we do still have that surface if needed. I'm going to use P on the keyboard to bring in these edges, noting that project and intersect will give us the same result, simply because we're on the midplane that we used to slice this in half. So create, project, include, and intersect would also give us that same curve. But now that we have this curve, remembering that everything else is curvature continuous, we're going to create a spline. I'm going to put a midpoint down here just for now, noting that we could delete it later. And then we're going to use curvature continuous with this edge and curvature continuous with this edge. This point right here, I'm going to select and delete and just take a look at the result to see where it is. You'll notice that we've got something funky happening right in the middle here, and it's sort of overlapping itself. The curvature continuous option, the curvature is being carried and it's creating that overlap. So what I'm going to do is right click and I'm going to insert a point, and then I'm going to hit escape, and then this point really needs to move. And you can see that it's sort of locking it in place. So I'm going to Control Z back to the point before I deleted that original point and sort of kept it out in space. So you can see here that it's looping back over. So what this means is that we are not able to create that curvature continuity that we want. So I'm going to delete that spline. I'm going to try one more time, but this time I'm just going to go start to end. Then I'm going to use curvature continuity here and over here. And notice without that midpoint, we don't have that loop happening in the center. So what we have now is a curve that should theoretically mimic the original bottom of this. And this creates a boundary for us. Now, if we want to, we can extrude that and we could take it in the opposite direction. So that way we have an edge that we can use to control tangency, or we could have just kept the curve there. But now we have an opening that has multiple edges. And unfortunately, the multiple edges don't really work for something like a loft unless we were to build out some additional edges or curves. So what we're going to try to do is patch this. I'm going to turn off enable chaining. I'm going to manually control this. And note that when I do this and I work my way around, let's go and deselect that, it's not letting me select this edge. So it doesn't let me grab that edge for some reason. It doesn't seem to think that it's connected properly. And this is something that does tend to happen from time to time, unfortunately. So a way that we can get around this is to go to the bottom. We're going to create a sketch on the bottom. And I am going to project this edge. I'm going to use P. And I'm also going to project this edge right here. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to create a line that goes from here up to the midpoint and a line from here up to the midpoint. The main reason that we're doing this is because we're going to use that to split the face. So the faces to split will be this midpoint here. We're going to use that triangle. And what this allows me to do now is loft from here to here and use this as a guide. So let's try this now. Loft from here to here. For my guide rail, we're going to select this edge here. And then we're going to try to control this with curvature continuity. Again, aligned edges. Curvature continuity, aligned edges, and then over here, curvature continuity. You can see that it's failing. It's giving us some problems. So this is telling me that that solution is just not working. So another option that we have is to bring back that copied surface. We know that this copied surface perfectly matches here. So what we're going to do is use that same last sketch that we created, and we're going to trim. So our trim tool is going to be this, and we're going to get rid of the pieces on both sides, which should leave us this little sliver behind. And that also means that we need to get rid of this edge here as well. So I'm going to hide my sketch, and I need to somehow get rid of this. We can do this with another trim. Again, we're going to just P on the keyboard to project this edge on the inside. And that should be good enough for a trim tool. So that'll be my trim tool, and I'll get rid of that little piece of the triangle. And theoretically, we should be able to stitch this and these pieces together. Let's go ahead and rotate this around. And what this will do is it'll just leave us those 4 openings. That little extrude that we created, looks like there's a little bit of a remnant in there. That remnant can go away, so I'm going to right click and remove it. And the little extrude that we created, I'm going to right click and remove it. And what I want to do is I want to fill in these areas here. So now we've got a start and an end. We can either use patch, and we can try to make it curvature continuous in there and see if that works. That looks pretty good. We can do the same thing to the other side. I've got grouped edges, which means that it's going to put all the edges together and they'll maintain the same option. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and stitch all this back together, these 2 little pieces, and say OK. So if I use Control and 4 to hide the edges, you can see that we're getting those blends. It's not perfect. There are still some problems with this method. I don't really like the patch tool. I don't think that it works as well as some other tools. So I can explore, I'm going to go back and delete those. I'm going to explore the loft and see if the loft gives me a better result. So I'm going to loft from this edge to this edge. I'm going to use my guides on both sides. And I'm going to try to use curvature continuity on both of these. I'm going to say aligned to surface, aligned to surface. Here we're going to use a, let's see, on rail 1, we're going to use curvature continuity. Rail 2, we didn't have curvature continuity in this corner, which is potentially what the problem is. So I'm leaving it connected, but note that it's not actually giving me a result. It's self-intersecting. And sometimes the reason for that is because the influence is too high. I might be able to change it to 0.5 and get away with it. And I can do the same thing for the rails. I can play around with some of the options. Sometimes connected will give you a result, but you can see here it's just not giving me the option I want. So unfortunately, the reason for that is because of this corner here. These are not curvature continuous, which means that it's going to end up giving me that little divot in there. So I'm going to go ahead and just use patch. I can try tangency. Sometimes that will give me a little bit better result. If we do curvature continuity, you can see that it's really driving it pretty hard. But this value here, by default, is 0.5. We can lower it to something a bit smaller. We can try to get it to like 0.4. But again, this corner is where the real problems are. So if you run into something like this, then ultimately what you have to do is you have to decide how much time you're going to spend getting this section to be right. And does that mean that you're going to trim, or you're going to split this up some more? And for us, I'm not happy with this result, so I'm going to back it up a little bit. So this goes back to that little bitty remove piece that we had here. So what I want to do is bring that piece back because we made sure that it had curvature continuity. And I want to go ahead and trim away this piece. So that last sketch that I created, we used as a trim. I'm going to go ahead and use that to get rid of this little piece in here. Now, sometimes this doesn't work simply because this is now part of the rest of it. So what we can do is we can do a split face. Faces to split. Our split tool will be that little curve. And that should allow us to select and delete that face. Okay, so we're kind of back where we started. But sometimes it's important to explore the tools to see if one of the methods will work. And if not, then we just have to sort of reassess the process. So at this point, I'm going to try to use patch on everything here. Notice when I do this, however, it's going around the entire thing. So I need to turn off enable chaining, and I need to manually select the edges that I want. I'm going to work my way around, select this, and now, theoretically, if I use curvature continuity, this should give me a better result. There's a little bit of like an aliased look of it right here. Sometimes you can turn on the analysis and get a look. I'm not too concerned with that. What I want to look at is the principal minimum. That looks okay. It's probably not perfect, but that looks okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to okay that surface creation. And this, for me, this is a better result than the previous one where we broke it up. And again, sometimes you have to play around with these options to figure out if it's a good solution. So we're going to stitch these together. And then we are going to mirror this body to the other side. So create, mirror, select bodies, mirror it across that midline, allow it to join, which will stitch it together. And now you can see that we've got those wing profiles on both sides, and we're only left with two bodies, the canopy and the wing. So if we look at this from the bottom, let's go ahead and rotate this around. If we look at this from the bottom and I bring that image back, we can see that it's not exactly the same, but we do have sort of a similar shape, right? So the wings come in, and one thing that we could do is we could change where these were actually hitting the bottom of the fuselage. So initially I had them going straight across. In reality, they probably should have been up just a little bit higher if I wanted to perfectly match that image. So in this case, the fuselage itself should have been exposed. But this is an interesting design problem and something that causes a lot of grief. And again, you could see that I tested 3 or 4 different methods. I tried patching it, I tried lofting it, I tried splitting it up, I tried putting the original piece back. And ultimately, that is unfortunately the process, is a little bit of trial and error to see which tool is going to give you the best result. Now, I have said it in other videos, and I think in this video it's also important that I think the surfacing tools in Fusion right now are not as good as they could be. They do need a little bit of work. They're really picky about some of the inputs. They're finicky about things like using that edge as a loft guide when it worked fine as a patch, but it wouldn't allow you to use it for a loft guide. So there are some things like that where we know that the curves had curvature continuity. Everything we did, we split up with splines that had curvature continuity. So we knew everything was smooth. So those are just kind of the things that we need to think about when we're trying to use this tool to model, in this case, airplane wings and the intersection between the chassis. But I think that's a pretty good result. I think that it sort of hits the points where we didn't just use a fillet. We wanted to push the sort of the intersection further forward. And you could always go back to those sketches where we created that sketch that we used to split up the fuselage. and we just made it a little bit bigger. So we could always go back and we could edit that sketch and sort of stretch it out. As long as we don't cross over any edges like this one here, as long as we don't cross over that, the features should update. Now, I say that, I don't have extreme confidence in that, but if you do some planning and you get your curves and the definitions right, it should work. But don't be surprised if it doesn't. So at that stage, I know last video I said I wasn't going to model any more of this, but I did think that the question about how to get those wings to blend in, I thought that was pretty important. And it is another complex surfacing thing that we can explore and sort of figure out how it works. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. As I said before, I am not planning to model this entire thing. I'm happy to answer questions and to try to help figure out workflows. But I do think it's important that when you're trying to learn these tools, whether it's forms or surfacing tools, that there is an exploration process that happens. You have to figure out where the tools work and where they don't work. And unfortunately, sometimes they're just not going to work. They're not going to give you a great result. Do also keep in mind that you can create form bodies. So, so for example, we could create a cylinder and we could use that cylinder as a surface. So if I scale this down, maybe scale it out and move it this way and start to build out a wing. Maybe we use it as, piece of the tail. So if we start to define things in this manner, what we can do is we can use those as surfaces. So when I'm done with this and I finish forms, I now have a surface here. And that was really easy to work with. And I can always go back and I can edit its shape. So for example, if I wanted to taper it in, I could make some adjustments by using Modify Edit Form. I could change the pivot point to be on the back. And let's go ahead and move this up here. I could scale this down to start to create that tail. So here we go. And I could finish form. And again, it just converts it to a surface. So now what we could do is we could trim this by using the chassis or the fuselage and get rid of that piece on the inside. And now we're starting to build out the rest of this. So keep that in mind that you do have other options. You don't necessarily have to do everything with a bunch of sketches and extrudes and sweeps and lofts. You can go in and make individual surfaces or multiple surfaces with form bodies for these complex shapes. The part that gets really tricky is when you try to make these complex shapes go together on one form body. It takes a lot of precision, a lot of time and finesse, just simply because getting the edges to flow properly to give you good results, it's just really difficult. It's not that it's impossible, but changing direction and building out the wings is just not an easy process. So I don't suggest that that's a starting point because the sketches and surfaces give you a little bit more precision or control, whereas the forms are a little bit more organic. So if you're fixed to some specific criteria sketching for certain features, then obviously stick with surfaces and solids. If you have a little bit more flexibility and freedom for creating shapes, then using the forms can be a great way to play around with it and get those shapes pretty easily. So in this case, again, I keep coming back to this, but if we were to select this entire thing and I wanted to scale it down, move it to a new location, maybe rotate it slightly, maybe take this and just pull it out and scale it down. You can see here how I can manipulate that shape really easily and it's still a surface when we're back here, right? So I still have that surface. I can still play around with its shape. It still trims properly because it still overlaps. And that's a much easier, more organic process than it is to go through everything that we did to try to get these to blend together. But just keep that in mind that is an option, something that you can play around with. And of course, in the description of the video, we have the starting point of this data set, but I'll also put the finishing point as well if you want to play with that. So that way you have a good basis. And again, a last note for you. For these kinds of designs, these kinds of models, I don't typically care too much about the timeline. I may be alone in that fact, but if I'm creating a mechanical design that's an assembly that's driven off of dimensions, then I spend a lot more time detailing those sketches, making sure that I have components and I organize everything really well. For something like this, I'm not as concerned with those because there's a lot of sort of artistic nature to creating the curves and trimming surfaces away and adding back to them and so on. That process takes a little bit more time, and spending all your time detailing sketches only to find that the feature that you're trying to do doesn't work and you have to change directions ends up taking something that you might spend an hour or two on, and you end up spending 10 hours for the exact same result. So it's really up to you if you want to spend that extra time on your features and sketches. But for me, at least while I'm exploring the design itself, I don't really worry too much about that. So again, if you have any questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.